I'm thrilled to introduce my next guest, the legendary Farouk Khan.
A homegrown talent will give you more mileage than a player you buy who you have very little knowledge or inclination that he will be the right fit. You look at Benfica, I spent a lot of time with the coaches there, and their business model is second to none. We populated all the national teams. We had at least 60 or 70% of our kids playing in the national teams.
Yeah. But where's that blueprint now?
They sometimes make the mistake of hiring the wrong man.
Why did you leave Kaizer Chiefs?
I think the clash of mentalities resulted in me moving on.
We will touch on his stint at Sundowns, Kaizer Chiefs, how he was so successful, and of course, the Stars of Africa Academy, where Coach Farouk has done so much. He joins me now for a chat. Coach Farouk. I say Coach Farouk because, of course, that's what you are. But a lot of people are asking, why aren't you going back to the Betway Premiership and coaching in local football and only dedicating your time to essentially building the next superstar? Maybe give us clarity. I know you've spoken about it at length in some of our personal chats and interviews as well. But why the need to stay to your true self and philosophy as someone who wants to develop talent for the country?
Well, I think all of us as coaches and technical people have a role to play. I've been a coach both at professional level. I've also been a head coach at Santos and won the then EPSA Cup, which is today known as the Nedbank Cup. So I've tasted victory at the top. I've tasted victory as an assistant coach with Mushina Tukral, with Ted Dumitro, with Gordon Ingerson. But I think I chose this role because that was the beginning of my career. I started as a youth coach in my local area. I started and then went on to study in Brazil and then came to the School of Excellence, where I think the whole journey started unwrapping. And I saw the need for proper youth development. And also, Mazola, you must understand, not all of us can be coaching at the top and neglecting the bottom. I think the bottom is so important. The foundation of football in any country in the world is dependent on how strong your youth development programs are. There's never been a country in the world that have won a World Cup without a strong youth development program.
Never.
You talk about Germany, Argentina, Brazil, England also. At the time they won it in 1966, it was a little bit early for development, but there was some form of development. So I think my journey and my destiny is to leave a legacy of producing players, even though people know that I am in a position to coach at the highest level.
Have we regressed if you look at the last 10 years or so that you've been doing this? And I think for a lot of South Africans, their reference point is always the Jabu Mahlangus of this world, the May Mahlangus of this world, your Tukelo Ranties, Tifo Mashamaites. And you look now, you struggle, in all honesty, to find that type of player in the current setup, at least from a professional level. But I'm sure you've got plenty of those guys at Stars of Academy as well, Stars of Africa.
Look, Mazola, there's a lot of good raw talent. The problem is that we don't find the talent at the right age, which is, I would say, when they're 6, 7 years old, because a complete cycle takes between 8 to 10 years to produce a complete player. And I think in the past, we were able to attract their talent because there wasn't so many academies that were professionally run. Now you look at the PSL, you look at the fact that they have a DDC league, you look at the GDL, kids want to play on TV. So our task to attract the best talent is also hamstrung to some extent. But I think our reputation precedes us, where people realize that if you want your kid to have an opportunity to maybe even play in Europe, we've produced so many players that have been able to go to Europe and stay in Europe for extended periods and play at some of the teams, the first division teams in Europe. So I think that is the aim of people that are really serious about their kids' development. I do also feel that the bigger clubs obviously have a great advantage because their supporters base look up to them and they hope their kids can one day wear that shirt as well and they have aspirations. So now you are sharing the raw talent amongst many role players. So you're not as privileged as you were before, where there was such a limited amount of development taking place that you could now have a share of the pie. But in saying that, I think schools also need to play a part. I think if we have proper development, there's enough players to go around, enough talent, raw talent, to be able to cater for all the development programs in the country. And that's what we need to do, Mazola. We need to create a huge base of talent. We need to create thousands of, I often hear the president of SAFA, Danny Duran, making mention that Spain have 30,000 youth coaches. And I think
Wow.
that's a good statistic. But they also have hundreds of thousands of youth players that are able to be serviced by that 30,000 youth coaches. We're now competing with so many different codes. We're competing with rugby, who's done an excellent job, cricket, other sports. And also we are competing with social media. Today, every kid spends more hours
Eish.
on his iPad and his phone than he
Huge
does on the
setback,
field.
that coach.
You know, so it affects your whole development cycle, which then makes it so much more. I would say it makes it so much more of an importance for SAFA and people in football to start creating opportunities and start making the game attractive to kids. To make the game attractive, where we have a saying in football that football is the beautiful game. The question we need to ask is, do we make football attractive for players and children? Do we make it attractive? Because once you make a sport attractive where kids go to train, they want to go to training. They put that iPad aside. They have aspirations. They enjoy being in the outdoors. They enjoy what the coaches are exposing them to. Then obviously the interest would grow, and we'd have more kids, attending these academies and development programs. And ultimately there'll be a bigger output of quality, technically gifted players.
How are you able to do that at your academy? Obviously, just a couple of months ago, we were with you when you were launching your new setup, seemingly taking it to the next level. But if you look across the country, some might argue that we are lagging behind here and there, as you say, competing with social media. And to add to that, the question I wanted to ask, do you think the level of the reserve league, the Diski Challenge, prepares a player to turn professional, or you need other aspects of it instead of just, I mean, the numbers are crazy. If you look at the numbers of people on TV and at the stadium, I know entrance is free or whatever the case may be, but it still shows that people have the appetite to watch youth football. It's always been like that, even from a school's point of view. But where are you bridging the gap from your academy's point of view?
Well, let me touch on the DDC. I think it's a fantastic concept. I think it's a very, very good concept. I do think that more can be done in as far as the developmental side rather than winning the league or winning the cups. I think more focus should be spent on ensuring that those players get the proper development, and no disrespect to the coaches that are doing it. I think they're doing a wonderful job. But I think the gap between playing in the DDC and the Premiership is a little bit too big for players to immediately make an impact. I think with the help of sports psychologists, with the help of intervention from other scientific aspects of the game, they can close that gap. But I think more importantly is to have a situation where players are developed mentally and have the right mentality to take on that role. I think too often you find kids, once they play for maybe one of the bigger clubs or they're in the DDC, already they start developing attitudes that they've arrived, not realizing that they have so much still to do to wear that shirt. If you look at a club like Chiefs, you have to ensure that you have the ability to have the impact that players in the past have had in the academy, as far back as when Dr. Kumalo and Sia Mapike, Thabo Moki made the jump from their youth development program into the first team. So that's a template that I think clubs need to utilize, that say, okay, what are we trying to produce? Okay, we know we had a Lucas Khadebe. We knew we had a Neil Toby. We knew we had a Shoes Michel, Dr. Kumal. What do we need to do to produce that player to be able to enjoy the same success that we have in the past? So I think that is where the DDC can benefit from insight on how to do that. I think there's still a bit of a gray area that more can be done. But I think as far as the game is concerned and the television coverage and everything, we can't fault anybody. I mean, kids experience living in hotels, flying with airplanes. They experience what every professional player experiences. So that already prepares them for that. But as far as the game is concerned, the numbers that we've seen can be increased tremendously. I'm talking about the time when we ran the School of Excellence. We within a year or two, we populated all the national teams. We had at least 60 or 70% of our kids playing in the national teams.
Yeah.
So surely something we did then was working.
But where's that blueprint now, coach?
The blueprint is sitting in the heads of those people. The Sam Batas, the Kevin Johnsons, the people that were involved at the time, the Junaid Mals, the Paradise Moketsis. I mean, the list is endless of people. But those people, I don't think, are being utilized to share that wisdom and knowledge. Because I think what has happened is, I think due to the fact that we are now faced with so much information on the internet, on YouTube, it's a case of cut and paste. So it creates a lot of confusion. Because you see, as a coach, you go and you do a SAFA course. The SAFA course gives you all the fundamentals of coaching, but it doesn't really prepare you to coach a team at a level of excellence. So now what do you do next? You go and look at what Man City is doing in training, but it's not appropriate to what your needs are.
Yeah.
So if you don't have the experience to be able to look at what works for you and what doesn't, you're just going to take things generally off the internet and utilize it, and ultimately you create more confusion.
Yeah.
You find often there's a school of thought that says your training should be a mirror of the game, but not at the expense of stifling the individual's creativity, the individual's technical ability, because too often we find we're trying to water down professional coaching to youth coaching, and it's not the way to go, because you understand that youth coaching works in an age-appropriate cycle. So what you do at the under 12, you don't necessarily do it in under 18. There's different steps that will lead to what an under 18 does. So you need to work on the basics firstly. You need to create a good foundation. And then later on, you build on all the other building blocks, which is the tactical awareness, the psychological factors, the social factors. You build it on, because you don't want to bombard a youngster with too much coaching. And I think often, Mazola, in my experience, and I sometimes have a lot of coaches that come and shadow me, and they're very enthusiastic now because they're standing next to me, so they shout out instructions, like, hey! And I have to say to them, young man, relax. Let the game flow.
Yeah.
Let the game. They don't need to hear your voice. They need to hear that whisperer in their minds what to do. They need to make decisions. They need to use the ability to scan and make decisions even before receiving the ball. They need to distinguish what technique to be used. What's the appropriate technique in this moment? So when you bombard them with instruction, their attention span is divided between what you're saying and what they need to be doing. So now you're stifling the development of that player.
When you look at the PSL at the moment, would you say which clubs perhaps are getting it right? I mean, if I were to get you in a room with one of the club bosses right now, what would you say to them in terms of coming up with a structure? Because it seems like, and we were talking off air about this, that you could have a coach for the senior team whose philosophy is very different to how the DDC team is playing. But I would think, I'm not a coach, but I would think the idea, if you're building an empire, is to have a synergy throughout. That's a reason you are having an academy, isn't it? For self-sustenance, if you like, where these players, if you are not spending too much money with transfers and whatever, because players are becoming more and more expensive, you are building your own super player to make it to the top league that you can even benefit from by selling abroad as well.
Well, if you look at best practice on the world, let's use Barcelona as an example. They brought Hansi Flick in now. But I guarantee you, when they sat down with Hansi Flick, they said to him, listen, this is how Barcelona plays.
Look at La Masia, yeah.
Look at La Masia. Don't have a disconnect where you come with your own ideas. Yes, come with ideas that can enhance what we're doing, but don't try to change our philosophy. Don't try to change our game model. And I think that there's no choice in that matter. As a club owner, the coach that you bring in must conform to your philosophy and game model. He must change, because you can't change the entire club for one person, but you can change one person for what the club believes in and have as their game model. I think that is where clubs have gone wrong, by as much as they make mistakes in selecting and purchasing the incorrect players, which we've seen on a number of occasions. They sometimes make the mistake of hiring the wrong man. And sometimes coaches have this, I would call it ego, where when I come in, it's my way or the highway. And immediately it then uh, sort of victimizes the players that have been there and have played in a certain way, because now they have to change the way they think and the way they play completely. And it also then victimizes the youth coming through, because they're used to playing in a certain way. Now they need to adapt. So I think if you look at Stars of Africa, if you look at our under sevens play, and you look at the Castle team play, it's a duplicate.
Yeah.
Because I will never allow a coach to get our under sevens to kick the ball long, because then I'm defeating the purpose. Because when that under seven goes to under nine and under nine to under 12, it's a progression of learning. So he doesn't. You don't need to unlearn to relearn. You know, it's a continuous process, and that is why it's so important to have a philosophy, a style of play, a game model written in stone. It must never change.
Give me some examples, Coach. Obviously, you do your work as a pundit and analyst for SuperSport as well. You've dissected top flight clubs here in South Africa. Are there examples where you've seen, for instance, of a player that moved from one club and he's lost to ultimately maybe the national team as well? Maybe a Coach Hugo, or in the past a different national team coach, even from a junior level as well, was thinking, oh, this guy could help us go to the junior AFCON or the senior AFCON, but suddenly their performance gets stifled when they move to a different club. And in terms of recruitment as well, should clubs be buying for the sake of buying because the player is a good player, and if he goes to achieve the Sundowns, he's so good that he has to fit into that system and play? Or should clubs be taking a different approach? I suppose there's many ways to look at it in terms of how to go about recruitment. What's the ideal way for recruitment?
You need to first ensure that when you have a scouting department, you have a highly qualified person, not just a highly qualified, but a highly experienced individual who has been through the different rigors of football, both at youth level and at professional football. You can't have a guy who's just been involved with professional football, because when you scout players, the best scouts are those that have been involved with development and knowing how to nurture talent. Because at youth level, you identify talent and you nurture the talent, so you know exactly what the fit is. If you look at the example that you made about clubs making the wrong choices when buying players, I think it's impulsive buying. So the player plays for Team A and he performs well. And sometimes when you play against him, he's got a performance of a lifetime, because now he wants to come to you because you're the big club. So he plays out of his socks. He performs brilliantly. And that image you have in your mind now directs you to sign this player, not taking into account how he will fit into your current philosophy and game model. And then the player comes, he can't adapt, and suddenly he becomes a player that you can't use anymore, that you need to move on. And we've seen a lot of misses in that regard. I think a club that comes to mind that have actually improved tremendously in that regard is Sundowns. And I think Sundowns, what they did well, as far back as when Ted was there, because Ted laid the foundation. I mean, guys followed after him and they benefited from his work. They had a good relationship with La Masia in Spain. They even brought some Spanish coaches down. They met with some of the great legends of Barcelona, the former Dutch international,
Johan Cruyff.
Johan Cruyff. I recall when
Nieskens even coached Sundowns
came
at some
down
point
as well. And they looked at their model and they tried to emulate it. Obviously, you're never going to get to perfect their model because their model is so far ahead. But I think Sundowns have moved in the right direction. Yes, we can argue that they sign players at huge sums of money, but those players really add value. On the other hand, some of the players that they sign from other clubs can't make that jump. They can't make that. So there is obviously going to be those that succeed and those that don't. But the club as a whole has done extremely well at the top. Where they lack is being able to develop players and move them through the system. We haven't seen that And as much as we sing the praises of Sundowns, that's where they need to improve in. You need to have homegrown talent. Currently, you have about 6 or 7 players at Barcelona that have made the jump. Yes, it took a while. It took a couple of years. But if you look at the quality of those players, you realize that that is the perfect model. You look at Man City, we don't realize that as much as they buy players, they also produce players that go on to play for other bigger clubs. So there's a business model attached to it.
Cole Palmer at Chelsea as
and
well.
there's so many others that have gone.
So many others,
Sancho also came from them. There's so many that we don't know about because they don't advertise it.
Yeah.
And similarly, you look at a club like Real Madrid. They don't have many youth in their structure, but they have many youth players that are playing for other clubs.
Yeah.
So what they generate is an income to buy those special players. So in summary, clubs need to create a business model. You look at Benfica. I spent a lot of time with the coaches there, and their business model is second to none. It's commercial and it's excellence. But I don't want to take too much time of yours to describe it, but it's out of this world.
Yeah.
And that is the model I think South African clubs need to take to move forward, because without the proper financial injection, we won't be able to produce world-class players.
Do you think maybe, I might, go off script a little bit. Do you think maybe they run away from that model because they risk dealing with the same issues you've dealt with, compensation, that you you produced? I don't know how many players you've produced. Too many. Don't really have a cent for most of them. To be fair,
it's actually sad. There's a saying that says, "Don't kill the golden goose." If I was a club owner, I'll be the best friend of Farouk, because then I have the opportunity to have the first look. On an ongoing basis, because development is cyclic. You're not going to produce top players every year. You're going to wait for it to happen every 4 or 5 years. And we've done that to some extent. We have a good crop of young players now that play in the Castle, 17, 18, of excellent crop of players that will go on to play professionally eventually. So that's the golden goose. For some reason, I think clubs don't really leverage off of the development program. It's a nice to have.
Yeah.
They tick the box. We have a development program. It gets sponsored, so who cares? But I think if they really maximize the potential of the academy, a lot of their headaches will disappear, because most times, a homegrown talent will give you more mileage than a player you buy who you have very little knowledge or inclination that he will be the right fit.
Yeah.
We've obviously seen so many players being bought by clubs and they spend a season and they move on or two. So I think, personally, I would say invest in your youth and make sure that you have the right people driving the process. We see the same thing with our national youth teams. Anybody can coach the national team, irrespective of his pedigree, irrespective of his background, irrespective of his experience. Yet on the opposite side, look at the bench of youth teams internationally. It's experienced, highly qualified people, because they realize that those people can share more wisdom in developing the player.
Some coaches have even coached in top flight level as head coaches of those teams.
Absolutely.
And they don't mind going back to development.
Because they're coming to plow back. And also, you need to groom your current pros to take over the top level, because that's where the managerial skills come in. But pure coaching exists mainly in youth. I'm not saying there's no coaching in professional football, but obviously a professional player is already fully developed. 100%. You just need to guide him. You need to manage him. You need to manage his your tactical approach and his mindset, which is purely, if you look at currently the number of games teams are playing, there's very little time to coach.
Coaches are crying about it at the moment. Ribeiro is saying it. Cardoso is saying it. Even Coach Wadu at Marumo Gallants. He just arrived yesterday and he's complaining that he's barely coaching the team.
Yeah, he hasn't got time, because that's why the preseason that they have is the best time to coach, because once the season kicks off and with teams that are qualifying for CAF, it becomes more difficult.
Yeah.
So you need people like the Pitso Mosimane is one of the greatest man managers, and I think those are the guys that you ultimately need at the top. People that can take the player and manage the ego, because you got a squad of quality players.
Yeah.
You can only play 11 at a time and a couple of subs. How do you keep that team happy? How do you keep the bench? Because as a coach, we always believe your first 11 are motivated. How do I keep the bench motivated? So when they come on, they can impact the game
Yeah.
positively.
Yeah. I suppose also this conversation we're having requires patience as well. You make examples with our European counterparts. And when we come here at home, you only see it for a short period and then the experienced players are brought in. I'll make an example. Malibongo Koza at Mamelodi Sundowns. You thought he was going to be the center back this season at 20 years old. Then they buy Suarez and the guy is sitting on the bench.
Absolutely.
Kaizer Chiefs have done that even in the days of Stuart Baxter. When they had a transfer ban under Gavin Hunt, they bring all these young players. You think, oh, the future. Ernst Middendorp has identified a few. Then the very next season, they sign 9 players. The kids are in the stands.
Yeah.
So, and obviously club bosses want trophies. It's difficult to find that balance, isn't it?
Well, it's absolutely difficult, but it's twofold. Firstly, no coach is going to neglect playing a Jabu Pule if he's well developed, because he's the best player when he comes through the ranks, because the other players that he have are good, they're experienced, but they don't have that ability he has. So I think it's incumbent on youth coaches to ensure that with the resources they have from the club, they produce the right players. And I'm saying this, that when those players get promoted, you find a player like Zwane at the moment, Chiefs, very good player. I think in training I've heard he's the best player.
Yeah.
But can he take that performance into the first team when they play on the weekend? And that is something where you need I would call him a mental coach to get him past those hurdles, because he's got the talent. It's just that you need to know what buttons to press. But in most cases, clubs employ young, inexperienced coaches. So where does that player gain that wisdom? Where does that player, you mentioned coaches coming from the top coaching down. That's a great advantage, because as a coach who's coached in the PSL, now working with youth, he knows exactly what buttons to press with Mazola. He knows how to explain to Mazola what he's going to expect when he reaches there. I had a great advantage because I worked in the academy and I worked with Mushin. So that complemented me well. Mushin welcomed me with open arms. So I was stealing when I was with Mushin. What is it that he wants from players in the in the first team? How does he deal with them? What are the stumbling blocks? Because when I used to take a team to play a friendly, the seniors would look at them like, hey, what are you guys coming to do here? And they would make some nasty comments. Hey, Baba, stand away from me. Don't come stand with me. Trying to intimidate them, because you see this guy coming to take your place. And we played that games every week. We'd play against the first team. And that is where Mushin was able to see the players that were in the academy, and he was able to assess whether they could make the cut. I don't know if they're still doing that.
Yeah.
But even if they're doing that, you still need a football psychologist. And there are people out there with the experience that can do that and can assist those youngsters to make the jump. The transition from academy to first team can be very traumatic. And sometimes when you overpraise these kids too soon, they eventually just fall to pieces because the pressure is so intense. You know, when you put on that Chief shirt and you're walking out there,
it's heavy.
Great expectations. It's a heavy shirt. And you need to debrief the player to make him, when he looks at that shirt, to feel, you know what, I can do this. You know, you gotta spend more time, because in professional football it's 80% psychological, 20% technical, because the technique has already been developed. So it's more a mental game.
Do you think maybe Chiefs were trying to do that with Arthur Zwane? Because you mentioned the young Samkelo Zwane. When Arthur Zwane was there, he seemed to have obviously a little bit more patience with the youth. You know, Wandile Duba came up, Mdu Shabalala came up, Samkelo Zwane came up. But as soon as he left, Coach Nabi now tried, but as soon as there's pressure, then they get Thabo Cele. And Thabo Cele is essentially taking that role that Samkelo Zwane plays. And it happens. You see it across, even with other top flight clubs in the Betway Premiership. It's kind of the same. A coach, an international coach who comes in, who doesn't have the background of what the club has been doing with the youth level, has his own ideas. I suppose that's one of the big challenges as well.
Well, the biggest challenge is when you have a coach like Nabi coming in, he can't be experimenting and obviously having the patience that you require from him, because he is expected to win silverware, especially if you're looking into the fact that Chiefs haven't won silverware in a long time. So the pressure is doubled, if you want to call it that. If Chiefs have been doing well, then you can say, okay, we're going to give the youngsters an extended period. So you expect the kids to be hitting the ground and making the performance that you expect from a top player, which is a little bit unfair, but that's the reality of the game. So when he brings in these youngsters, which I think Nabi has done, he's brought a lot of youngsters on, and the results haven't been forthcoming. So the question is, what we spoke about earlier, is there a disconnect between how Nabi plays and how the academy develops? And if there is a uniformed approach, if there's a philosophy in place, then there shouldn't be a problem, because the way Nabi plays is exactly how the kids are being developed and trained to play. So the transition or the adaptation period becomes much smaller. I think as fans, we become a bit anxious when we see these kids come in, but we want to have our cake and eat it. We want the kids to have time, and we want to win matches. Because the minute they don't win, we are the first to say, why is he playing so and so?
Yes.
I've heard lately people saying, Novo must go on loan. Zwani must go. So the same people that sang those youngsters' praises
when
are
they
now
were promoted
asking for
at
them
first,
to be loaned out. So it's a very cruel world. And that is why I always say your development has to be systematic. It has to be scientific. It must be such where players grow, where we take into account their natural talent, their natural skill, and never try to work against it. You know, I mentioned something which I think we shouldn't forget. In the past, we didn't have development programs. What was the form of development? Was kids playing. I wouldn't call it disorganized, but football that's played where there's no rules, where the ball stops when the car passes, where the lady walks with her handbag and the guy traps the ball, where he has to jump over the drain, which was a hurdle. And they've developed phenomenal skills. The likes of Kaiser, the likes of Jomo, they played street football. And then they moved forward to schools football, where there was such a huge hype about schools football, where on the day when it was Orlando High playing against another team in Soweto, the stadium or the ground was filled. There was fans, and you, as Mazola, wanted to impress that beautiful lady out there, so you'd play your best football. And these were all ingredients that molded these players. And then what happened after that? That same performance was then elevated to the soccer field. We had players that were able to express themselves. I mean, I was privileged to work with Ace Nutsuleng for many years, the gentleman of another level. I mean, humble, down to earth, but a genius. And what he said to me was he honed his skill by starting to juggle a ball to the shop. His mom used to send him to the shop. Him and his friend, she'd forgot that she didn't, ask him to buy sugar, and he'd go back. So to and fro, he'd juggle the ball, this tennis ball. And that honed his first touch. And he was a player. There was a stage when the late Eddie Lewis called him a cheat because he didn't defend as much. And at Orlando Stadium, he went to the side and he took his shirt off. He says, okay, you go play. And the game came to a halt. But this was the impact these players had. Today, which player in the PSL commands that respect that Jomo had, that Kaiser had, that Teenage Bloodlight? We need to produce those players because our genetics hasn't changed, Mazola. We still have the same genetics, but we're trying to put our game into handcuffs, straight jackets. Africans are like Brazilians. They don't like straight jackets. They want to dance. They want to enjoy. But when that enjoyment is done in a very structured manner, where they don't keep the ball and do funny things for the sake of it, you look at Kaiser Chiefs, the young man, not Chaba, the other youngster, very skillful player.
Which one? Ngobo, no.
Vilakazi.
Oh, yes, it's Mfundo.
Yeah. Very good player. Yeah. Now, if you can channel that energy, that skill, what stops him from being a world-class player that we see often on our TV screens? Nothing. But I think to some extent...
And a lot of us thought this was going to be his season.
Yeah, but he's the type of player that needs to definitely get more game time because they need a player like him. And obviously, we can't question the coach for his reasons because he's obviously saying he's protecting the ball. I don't think Messi needed to be protected at 17. They threw him in, he got kicked, and he became the best player.
That's how you grow.
You only grow if you go through the fire.
Coach, this conversation could go on for 100 hours. I want to jump onto a new segment that we've introduced now.
Yeah.
We tell people beforehand who our guest is, and they weigh in some questions. I'm going to ask you a few questions from here. Unfortunately, because of your history, a lot of them are Chiefs related. So
Okay.
you'll have to bear with me there. So let me fire away a few. Um, uh, Someone is asking, why aren't our youngsters going abroad? Obviously, also on the back of 21-year-old Samukelo Kabini of TX Galaxy, he's just signed for Molde in Norway. Obviously, one would say a stepping stone league to the bigger leagues in Europe. But one of the first questions is here: why do you think some of our youngsters are not making it to Europe?
I think we haven't really programmed our youngsters on what to expect in Europe. I've had two players now, Modiba and Williams, that spent a month in Portugal. And the first thing when I called them, they said, "Coach, this game is quick. The game is very much attuned to be forward thinking. The game is very physical. And the mentality you require is such that in training, there's no rules that says you can't kick your teammate. So they go into you full out. You got to just endure. You got to ride those tackles.
Yeah.
And you are put on a stage where there's kids coming from everywhere in the world. Brazil being a country that has so many players playing abroad, Croatia, all over the Netherlands, they all move towards countries like Portugal and Sweden where they can get an opportunity to showcase their talent. So you're not competing with just a couple of players from Africa. You're competing with players from all over the world that want to play in Europe because Europe is the place to be when it comes to football. So it's important that you take these things into account and you then send that mandate, that memo, you send it to your coaches and say, this is what the player should look like in 5 years or in 6 years. And not just have players prepare to win the GDL or the DDC or the local leagues, the RCLFAs. No, because that is where I think currently our coaches are focusing on is the game at the weekend, neglecting the building blocks. There's a lot of building blocks that come into place. I'm going to tell you something. At the school, we never played in a league. And when I tell this to people, they say, wow. No, Stephen Pienaar never played league football. But when we finished with him, he could go to Ajax in Cape Town and ultimately to Ajax in Amsterdam. Oljo Mabizela. All of these kids didn't play league football. We used to play strong, friendly games. Now, the advantage there was when we play against senior players or stronger players, they don't go all out to kick you. But when you play in your own league, the opposition are there. If you're a skillful team, they are there to stop you. They're not there to try and outplay you because they know their limitations. So skillful players become inhibited. Younger players become fearful. So I think that is something we need to remedy where we have leagues where there's strength for strength. SAFA needs to create leagues that is strength for strength. You look at, with all due respect, the GDL is a good league. But every year, who wins the league? Chiefs? Sundowns? I don't know if Pirates have a team there as well. Pirates have done away with their youth. But those are the clubs that are standing out. The others become cannon fodder. So every week, if you look at the results, Chiefs hit a team 7-0, 8-0, 9-0. It's not good for development. Chiefs need to play against teams that can go close with them, they compete, which is happening in the DDC to some extent. But also in the DDC, there's the haves and the have-nots. I think all the teams have to aspire to meet the criteria, the standard. Then that takes care of competition. Combined with good development, we'll see more players going to Europe. Ultimately, when those players go to Europe, like we see the Brazilians and the Spanish do, they come back to their national teams. And now suddenly you see strong under 17s, under 20s, under 23s, because where do they own their talents? In Europe. And where is the best football being played? In Europe. Arguably, I mean, the Brazilians could be arrogant and say, no, but we play the best football. No, most of their best players end up in Europe. So that must be our aim. And when Hugo Bruce said it, I think some of us took objection to it. What is this man saying? But he was telling the truth. He says, every year we struggle to qualify at youth level. And that is already a huge problem for our football. If our youth teams are not qualifying, and if they do qualify and they get knocked out in the first stage, it's an indication that we need to do more.
Coach, we've got a question here from Mudise Muntua. He's asking, why did you leave Kaiser Chiefs? We need you. We need you to rebuild our youth structures.
Well, Kaiser Chiefs played a huge role in my development, and I have so much to thank the chairman, Kaiser Mataung, for entrusting me with the job. I was at the School of Excellence. I was running the development, and then I had a super center at Max Park. And we once played against the Kaiser Chiefs development team.
Yeah.
And we fortunately gave them a bit of a football lesson. And they approached me. They had the late Butler. They came. They said, "Listen, what are you doing? How do you mean?" I said, "No, we just do what we have to do." Played it down a bit. I met with Kaiser. He said to me, "Look, you're working at Transnet, but which, we can have you here on board." Which I said, "No, I don't need the office. I'm on the field. It's fine, Kaiser. I'll work for Transnet in the morning with the School of Excellence, the projects in the afternoon." I used to race back from Esalen Park.
Yeah.
I think I must have got a lot of tickets at Milo Park. And then I was busy with that project, okay?
Yeah.
And it produced some phenomenal players, as you all know. And then I had the fortune of Mushin inviting me to work with him. He had just lost the league. Patrick Mbutu,
Yes.
Jabu went AWOL on the last day.
They were on my street because I'm from Bethlehem in the Free State. They were down the road in my street because they were playing in Kwakwa against Kwakwa Stars. Yeah,
absolutely. So you knew more than that. And the man would have won a league with Chiefs. It was just that these guys let him down, and they were very important players. And then he spoke to me about coming to work with him, and there was a lot of players that we already promoted, and we had a fantastic relationship. Eventually, he asked me to accompany him to Santos. He then left Santos over a month. I took over at Santos with Bubi, and we did quite well. And then Kaiser came to fetch me. He says, "Listen, you sell your house." I said, "No." He says, come home. When Kaiser says, "Come home," you go. You tell Gulam,
yeah.
"I'm going home," And I was also blessed then to work with my mentor, Ted Dimitro.
Yes.
God has been so good to me in this football world that I worked with somebody that groomed me. And we did well at that time. And then when Ted decided to resign, I was told to basically take over. And I understood the fact that having won the league twice was a bit premature because I haven't been that extensively involved as a head coach. And they brought in Ernst Middendorf. It was just a clash of mentalities. I don't want to badmouth Ernst. I think he's a good coach, but his philosophy, my philosophy, just clashed.
You were happy with Skara doing 360. He was.
I was happy with Skara doing 280. For me, Skara would have been playing because the season before, Skara was our best player in the club. And yet we had some very, very, we had great players, but Skara was just something out of this world. So, the Skaras of this world, etc., were the type of players that we looked at. Because remember, Chiefs didn't just win. We won in style. When you go to the stadium, there was a brand of football that was easy on the eye, etc. So I think the clash of mentalities then resulted in me moving on. And I was not even long after that where Sundowns came knocking, and I then went to assist Gordon Egerson. So that's where I left Chiefs. But a lot of me in my heart still feels for Chiefs. I still love the team. When you are part of such an institution and you get treated as well as they do. I mean, everything is found at Chiefs. I mean, when you come there, you get your kit, you got your own change room. It's an African club in Europe, if you want to call it that. It's got everything. There's no reason for Chiefs not to perform because management see to every need of players and coaches. So there's nothing that you can complain about. I think they have the best marketing team in Africa, arguably headed by Jessica Mataong. So all the ingredients are there, and that makes it sometimes difficult when you see the team not performing the way it should. You hope that things can change because this team has to be a team that competes with the likes of Sundowns. At the moment, Sundowns are basically, I mean, how many years is it now? 6 years that they've won the league?
7.
7 years. It's just never happened in the history of South African football that a team wins 7 consecutive leagues in a row.
There's a guy here, Sianda Jola Jr. He says, Sir Farouk, do you think the gap between the top 3 of South African top flight will be closed in terms of financial muscle And with other clubs like Chipa and Galaxy, if they were to get sponsors, whether they'll be ever able to catch up with the top three, especially Sundowns, we just mentioned, now winning 7 league titles in a row.
It is something that's achievable. It has been done in other countries where we've seen teams closing that gap, where at least 2 or 3 teams constantly compete. But I think it needs a mindset that it's not just about Patrice Motsepe's millions that wins him leagues. It's about his structure. It's about his scouting department that often sign the right players. And I think a club like Chiefs have the financial muscle, so does Pirates, to buy top players. We've seen when they do have the quality players that they can compete. Pirates is a case in point where we've seen now that even though they have, we would argue, a few games in hand, which doesn't mean points, they're still competing. They're still breathing down the neck of Sundowns, and Sundowns have performed outstandingly. I think they only lost 3 games this season. So yes, there is that, but you need to do something different. If you do what you've been doing, then you'll get the results that you've been getting. So my answer to our friend there is, in football, everything is possible. You just need a plan.
And then finally from Benzo Lerato, where is our boy KG? He should be in Europe, at the very least, the 3rd division by now.
KG is destined for great things. I think we need to be patient. Maybe even higher than 3rd division. But if he can start even in a 2nd division, it's going to be huge. We had Luther Singh, who started at, was it Braga? And went on. We had Tukelo, who went to Bournemouth eventually. We had May Maslang, who went to Helsingborg, but there was a process. I think we would have had Tito Masangwani also playing in Europe. He was a little bit impatient, him and Juninho Palace. They were missing home a little bit, and obviously things didn't work out as much as they would have liked in Europe. But because the standards are so high, you need to exercise patience at times. So the good thing we've realized with KG is we're sending him young. He's now 17 and he's already been to Europe. When he got back, he's selected now for the under-20s. So there's building blocks now. We gotta manage KG. We don't want KG to get carried away with the moment. He's a very sensible young man. When you praise him, he takes it with a lot of humility. And I think if we can manage his ego, then there's definitely a chance that he could end up in Europe.
Well, on that note, let's close it with that. As I said, the conversation with Coach Farouk can go on forever because there's so much to discuss, from development football and even our top flight here in South Africa. And that's it from us here Behind the Boot with Super Geno.